August 7, 1945, 6:30 in the morning. A railway siding neared the village of Staton Cross in the Scottish borders. A veil of mist drifted over the quiet platform as the freight train came to a hissing stop. Inside the wooden wagons, 200 German prisoners sat in heavy silence. 6 years of war had stripped them of everything: strength, certainty, even hope. Now they were captives on foreign ground, weary and hollow-eyed, unsure of what lay ahead. Through narrow slats, they glimpsed rolling fields glistening with dew, so unlike the shattered towns and battle-scarred soil they had left behind. The doors groaned open. British guards motioned them forward. One by one they stepped down, unaware that this remote corner of Scotland would change their lives forever. The men braced for anger, shouts, blows, humiliation. They'd heard the stories of captured soldiers and what fate awaited them. Yet the guards said nothing, only arranged them into neat lines and led them down a winding lane through the Scottish borders. Hawthorn hedges spilled white blossoms into the damp morning air, and birdsong drifted between the trees. The scent of rain and earth hung thick around them, unsettling in its calm. As they neared the village of Staton Cross, farm workers paused their work to watch in silence. The Germans lowered their eyes, expecting hostility. But no words came, no insults, no stones, only the steady crunch of boots on gravel and, far off, the soft, unbroken lowing of cattle across the fields. By August 1945, Britain held hundreds of thousands of captured Germans and Italian soldiers, and its prison camps were filled beyond capacity. Food was scarce, and the nation's farms faced a desperate shortage of labor. With most men still serving abroad, the burden had fallen on the tireless women of the land army, but even their efforts couldn't bring in the harvest alone. Faced with mounting need, the government made a controversial choice: release prisoners under guard to work the fields. The very men who had once fought against Britain would now help feed the country they had sought to break. In Staton Cross, the prisoners were housed in a requisition manor on the village's edge. The building was cold and drafty, yet it offered shelter and beds. That first evening, they received bowls of soup and slices of bread, meager, but more than many had tasted in weeks. Some of the older men quietly wept, the weight of everything they had endured pressing down on them. They had survived 6 years of war, and now, in this uneasy calm, their only hope was simply to endure the fragile peace that had replaced it. The next morning, farmers came to gather the workers assigned to them. Walter Greenhill was among them, a 62-year-old man with a back bent from decades of toil and hands knotted like old tree roots. He had lost a son at Dunkirk, and his nephew had fallen in North Africa. When an official informed him that 4 German prisoners would assist with the spring planting, Greenhill remained silent. He nodded quietly and guided the men to his truck, ready to begin the work without complaint, accepting the unusual arrangement with steady resolve. The drive to his farm lasted 15 quiet minutes. The German prisoners sat in the back, taking in the rolling hills and green fields of the Scottish borders. Walter's farm was modest, around 100 acres of arable land with a small herd of dairy cows. His wife had passed 2 years earlier, leaving him to manage alone, aided only occasionally by neighbors. Upon arrival, he gestured toward the barn, the scattered tools, and the fields waiting to be plowed, silently outlining the work that lay ahead. One of the Germans, a man named Erich Schmidt, stepped forward. He was 31, gaunt and sharp-eyed. In careful, halting English, he asked Walter Greenhill what needed doing. Walter studied him for a moment, then directed them to begin with the north field. He pointed out the plow and the harness for the horses. Schmidt nodded knowingly. He had grown up on a farm near the Black Forest and was familiar with such work. The other 3 men were city boys, awkward with the tools, but Schmidt patiently guided them. By midday, they had managed to turn 3 acres. Walter observed from the gate, astonished. They labored steadily, without any complaint. At noon, Walter's daughter, Clara, arrived carrying lunch. She was 18, with pale hair and a careful, watchful manner. When the war began, she had been just 15, raised on stories of the enemy and their deeds. Now they sat in her father's field, sharing the bread and cheese she had packed. Clara placed the basket gently on the ground and turned back toward the house, yet she couldn't ignore the sight of their faces. They appeared weary, young, and human, hardly the monsters she had imagined. Over the weeks that followed, a steady routine took hold at Staton Cross. The prisoners arrived at daybreak and labored until dusk. Walter could not pay them directly, yet he ensured they were fed. Clara often brought extra provisions, and sometimes Walter joined them during breaks, sharing tea from a flask. Words were scarce, but gestures conveyed meaning. Mrs. Davison encouraged small exchanges, while Lisa taught basic English, plow, seed, rain, and Walter learned fragments of German in return. Gradually, the sharp edge of distrust softened, replaced by a quiet, practical understanding. It was not full trust, but it was enough to sustain their work. In the village, feelings about the prisoners were mixed. Some villagers believed it wrong to show any kindness to enemy soldiers, while others accepted the practical reality. The work had to be done, and the men were here regardless of opinion. Over time, something surprising unfolded. The prisoners grew familiar to the community. Children playing near the fields waved, and several farmers began inviting them in for tea. Mrs. Davison, an elderly widow whose husband had fallen in the First World War, brought cake on Sundays. She understood the loneliness of being far from home and treated Schmidt and the others with quiet warmth, bridging the distance between enemy and neighbor. By the summer of 1945, the prisoners labored across numerous farms around Staton Cross. They gathered wheat, cared for animals, and mended fences. Some, skilled as engineers or tradesmen, repaired farm machinery, while others with medical knowledge aided the village doctor when the clinic became busy. Gradually, the lines between prisoner and local began to fade. Though still under guard, they were increasingly seen as part of the community, strange but necessary neighbors, whose presence reshaped the rhythms of life in the Scottish borders in ways no one had anticipated. Schmidt formed a deep bond with the Greenhill family. He worked longer and harder than the others, arriving before sunrise and leaving well after sunset. He had a wife and young son in Berlin, from whom he had not received news for over a year, uncertain if they were safe. Clara noticed how his hands occasionally trembled when he believed no one was observing, a quiet reflection of the worry he carried even amidst his relentless labor in the fields of Staton Cross. One afternoon, Clara handed Schmidt a letter she had written in simple English. It promised that when the war ended, if he needed help locating his family, she would do her best to assist. Schmidt read it 3 times, absorbing every word, before folding it neatly and slipping it into his pocket. He thanked her in German. She did not understand the language, yet the warmth and intent behind his words were unmistakable, and she felt the quiet connection between them deepen in the fields of Staton Cross. Not every story was kind. In the nearby village of Royston, one prisoner made a desperate bid for freedom. He didn't get far. By evening he was found shivering and exhausted, hiding in a damp barn. They sent him to a stricter camp farther north. The event unsettled everyone, a sharp reminder that these men, however weary, were still the enemy. Though the war was nearly over, its scars lingered in every heart. Some villagers held fast to their bitterness, seeing the prisoners only as a burden to endure. Yet others began to see something different, a flicker of shared humanity, proof that beneath the uniforms and orders were simply men, frightened and trying to endure. By early autumn, even after Japan's surrender on August 7, 1945, the men held in the Scottish borders found themselves in uncertainty. The war had ended, yet they remained behind the wire. Repatriation moved at a crawl. Germany lay shattered and divided, its borders blurred, its future unknown. Many prisoners no longer knew if their homes still stood, or where their families had gone. With nowhere certain to return to, they stayed in Britain, working quietly and waiting for word. In Staton Cross, Erich kept working on Walter's farm. That season's harvest was the finest the Scottish borders had seen in years. Walter said it was the extra help, but it was more than that. Erich brought a steady, thoughtful resolve to every task, tending the fields as though they belonged to him. Walter soon depended on him, not only for strength, but for insight. When a fence sagged, he sought Erich's judgment. When a field needed shifting, they mapped out the plan together. On one cold November morning, a letter finally reached Erich. It had taken months to find him, slipping through Red Cross desks and military hands. His fingers shook as he broke the seal. It was from his wife. She and their young son were alive. They had escaped the devastation of Berlin and taken refuge in a small village close to the Austrian frontier. They were safe, weary, underfed, but alive. Erich sank onto the barn step and cried. Walter discovered him there later. He didn't ask a single question. He simply rested a steady hand on Erich's shoulder and quietly walked away. Christmas in Staton Cross that year felt unusual. The prisoners were allowed to attend a small service in the village church. Some villagers were unhappy with the idea, but the vicar would not change his mind. He spoke of forgiveness and the hard journey ahead for everyone. Erich sat at the back, holding his cap. Clara was a few rows in front. After the service, in the cold air outside, she walked over to him. She had made a scarf and gave it to him shyly, saying the fields were cold and he would need it. Erich accepted it, his eyes filling with tears. In careful, broken English, he told her she had a gentle heart and that the world needed more people like her. Repatriation orders finally arrived in early 1946. Erich and the other prisoners were to return to Germany in stages. The night before his departure, Walter invited him into the house. They sat together by the fire, sipping weak tea. Walter spoke quietly of his son, lost at Dunkirk, and the fierce hatred he had once felt for the Germans. Yet meeting Erich had changed something, not erased the grief, but softened it. Walter listened as Erich talked of his own brother, killed on the Eastern Front, of the senselessness of it all, of how neither had truly wished for this war. They remained in silence for a long while, two men from opposite sides of a finished fight, bound together by sorrow and understanding. The following morning, Erich and the other prisoners were lifted onto waiting trucks. Villagers had come out to see them off. A few raised their hands in quiet farewell. Mrs. Davison handed Erich a small parcel of food. Clara stood next to her father, her scarf snug around her neck. Erich met her gaze and nodded. She nodded back. Slowly, the trucks rolled away, rumbling down the lane toward the railway station, carrying the men toward a home and life that had shifted during their absence. Erich returned to Germany to find his farm near the Black Forest in ruins. Yet his wife and young son were safe, and they began rebuilding slowly, surviving in the shattered post-war economy. He never forgot Staton Cross. He sent Walter a short letter, thanking him for his generosity. Walter replied, and over the years they exchanged a few more letters, brief messages, small gestures of kindness bridging the distance between their two lives. In 1960, Erich Schmidt returned to England, having saved for many years. He longed to see the farm once more and thank Walter Greenhill properly. Arriving without warning, he walked up the familiar lane, just as he had 13 years before. Walter was in the yard, older and slower now. At first, he did not recognize the man approaching. Then Clara smiled. Walter's expression shifted from surprise to joy. They embraced, two men who had once been on opposite sides, now reunited simply as friends, bound by years of memory and gratitude. Erich remained in Staton Cross for a week, helping with the harvest as he had years before. Clara, now married with children, invited him to dinner. They spoke briefly of the war, but mostly about life, rebuilding, and what lay ahead. On his final day, Erich and Walter stood together in the Northfield, the same field they had plowed in 1945. The wheat rippled in the breeze, golden and abundant. Walter remarked that the soil and field were the same, yet everything else had shifted. Erich nodded in agreement. Everything had indeed changed, and yet some bonds remained. Similar stories played out across Britain. Thousands of German and Italian prisoners labored on farms during and after the war. Some returned home without looking back, while others kept friendships that endured for decades. A few chose to stay in Britain, marrying local women and raising families. The connections were not always simple, memories lingered, and pain remained. Yet, in the quiet spaces between resentment and forgiveness, something profoundly human took shape, showing that even after conflict, understanding and compassion could grow across old divides. The children of Staton Cross grew up hearing the story of the German prisoners who helped with the harvest. Some thought it sentimental, but others saw a deeper truth, that even in the darkest times, kindness could endure, enemies could become neighbors, and a shared meal, a gentle word, or a simple act of understanding could plant seeds of goodwill that lasted far beyond the end of the war. By the time Walter Greenhill passed away in 1967, Erich had visited Staton Cross 3 more times. At the funeral, Clara read a letter Erich had sent. It spoke of deep gratitude, of the generosity shown to a man who had expected none. It mentioned the scarf his young son still treasured. It told of a friendship born from circumstance but maintained through choice. The final lines lingered in the hearts of those listening. Erich wrote that the war had taken much, his youth, his homeland, his certainty, but it had also given him something unforeseen, the understanding that even after devastation, people could choose compassion over bitterness, and that a farmer in the Scottish borders could look at a broken German soldier and see not an enemy, but a fellow human being striving to find his way home. The fields around Staton Cross continued to yield wheat. The barn where Erich Schmidt first took up a plow still stands, repaired and repainted countless times. The village has changed, as all places do, yet the memory endures, preserved in stories, tucked away letters, and fading photographs of men standing together in the field, sleeves rolled up, faces worn but serene, a quiet reminder of the unlikely friendship and shared labor that once brought them together across the divides of war. It was not a grand tale. No battles raged here, no treaties were made, just a quiet moment within a vast, terrible war. It was a story of prisoners and farmers, of mistrust slowly turning to respect, and of small, steadfast acts of kindness that endure even as the world collapses around them. And it was about 2 men, once enemies, who learned that while hatred could be chosen, so too could compassion. If this story of unexpected humanity resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know your thoughts on this remarkable friendship in the comments below, and we'd love to hear where in the world you are joining us from. Thank you for watching, and for helping to keep these important stories alive.